Hey guys, what's up? Public back with another video, and today this is the last covenant in our series, looking at each of the covenants and kind of saying, okay, what's good about this, what's bad about it, and what's just frankly ugly about it. Hopefully this gives you guys enough of a look through to see like, hey, is this the covenant I want to pick? What am I leaning towards? And most importantly, what feedback can we give to Blizzard about what just isn't working right now? Alright, so let's get started. Let's get into what's good about the Kyrian covenant. Okay, so first things first, very strangely, no one really expected this, but actually Summon Steward, which is the Kyrian signature ability, is probably one of the best signature abilities you could ask for if you really care about, you know, optimizing your character from like a rating perspective specifically. There are a lot of fights, I think about half of them in the raid, that have some sort of bleed or something that it can't be dispelled except for this potion, which does have a bleed cleanse, right? It cleanses curses, bleeds, poisons, all this great stuff, right? You get 3 charges of it. It does share a cooldown with some other things, like a consumable health pot, for example. But, you know, that is still very strong and can be especially great on, like, a progression boss or whatever. There are some cases in dungeons where this can be useful as well, but I just want to kind of call it out that from just a consistency standpoint, is it very exciting? No. Does it give us more movement? No, not really. But we do get that extra health. We do get that bleed cleanse, which could help us progress further in the fight, potentially live longer. It's actually pretty great. So, not the most exciting, but, you know, frankly, you know, the little guy's adorable, right? He's great. Well, what's not to love? So, yeah, again, it's not movement, and right now there really isn't a soulbind that gives us that, but it's still a great option to have, and, you know, probably one of the best from overall, like, raid utility perspective. So, that's a great thing about the Kyrian Covenant right off the bat. And then moving on to soulbinds real quick, they actually have 2 pretty decent soulbinds, at least from my perspective in that PvE world. I don't think either of them are particularly super strong, like some of the ones you might have seen in Night Fae or Venthyr, but I think they're good enough, at least right now. It does kind of depend on some numbers tuning. I'm making some assumptions here, but let's get into this. So first things first, Pelagos. Again, I put him kind of at the meh tier, but I don't think he's bad necessarily. It just kind of comes down to tuning. So first things first, you get Let Go of the Past, or you can choose Let Go of the Past, rather. Using a spell grants 1% versatility. If you use another one, it stacks up to 5%. This is basically like hit combo or that mastery, I think, for Windwalker Monk still, which isn't that difficult to keep up as a Shadow Priest. It's definitely a little harder now than it used to be because we are somewhat chaining Mind Flays together. But even still, even if you lose it, you get it back relatively quickly because we do cast several abilities, especially now that we're redotting more often than we used to. So not too difficult to keep this up. It might be kind of a pain or, you know, frankly annoying if you don't like that playstyle, but 5% versatility here is pretty solid. Not going to complain about that at all. Okay, and then moving on, you actually guarantee get all these abilities, right? So you're never choosing with this soulbind to pick a conduit or this DPS trait, which we do see a lot on other soulbinds. This guy, you just get these 2 static abilities and that's it. There's no real choice here except do you want this piece of utility or that piece of utility. None of the kind of things that you get from Pelagos are that great in terms of that utility option. But the second guaranteed ability that you get is Combat Meditation. This is on the last row, which is activating Boot of the Ascended, which is our Covenant ability. Gives you 5% mastery for 20 seconds. And then you can walk over like little blue orbs on the ground to extend this duration. For the most part, the blue orbs spawn relatively close to you. And it's just a matter of remembering that they're about to spawn and making sure you walk over them. So it's definitely not that bad. So in terms of like how useful this soulbind is, I think there's not a lot of compromises here, which is why I put this in the good category. You're not necessarily giving anything up, but you're not getting anything super great either. But you can easily run triple DPS conduits and not feel like you're losing out on something really impactful. Like, for example, you know, in Nagia Venthyr land, you can't get Dauntless Duelist and a DPS throughput conduit, right? You can't do that. You do only get 2 if you pick up Dauntless Duelist. Here you can still run 3 and get both these DPS ability, which is nice. There's just no choice to get a third one, which is how this works. So again, not bad, not the worst, but I think still a good option. And then moving on to Kleia. So Kleia is another soulbind you get here. Honestly, great for healing. So I do want to caveat that if you do end up playing like some disc on the side or some holy on the side as your Shadow Priest, you'd probably use Kleia as like your healing soulbind, but you know, obviously that could change. But from like the perspective of, you know, a raider as a Shadow Priest or dungeon group, whatever, there are a lot of utility options here that I think are worth still keeping this in the good category. At least as an option to have if you don't want to use Pelagos for that just straight damage. So first things first, you get to choose Ascendant File as an option. which renders you immune to curse, disease, poison, and bleed effects for 15 seconds after using your file, right? So not only can you use the file to cleanse it, you're then also immune to those effects for 15 seconds. This feels awesome. I can, again, from a rating perspective, from a dungeon perspective, having the utility, basically like a pseudo, not immunity, but it is very similar to that, right? Like you do still take damage, obviously, but it can be very, very nice and competes directly with Necrolords have an end to your ability that puts this on Fleshcraft, but this is just on the actual potion itself, which feels miles better, especially Mythic Plus. So right off the bat, very, very awesome utility here. Next up, we get Pointed Courage. Critical strike is increased by 1% for every nearby enemy or ally, up to 5%, which is pretty solid. Again, with this guy, you are choosing to take this and then not a DPS conduit, so you can't get 3 DPS conduits if this is what you want. But again, I think it's actually a pretty solid option, especially considering there's going to be a lot of cases where you're able to be stacked or you're around enemies or whatever. It's not a super far away, range, so you just be kind of next to people, but there's a lot of fights where that's the case inside the raid, so you should be able to keep this up relatively easily. It's just going to come down to strength of this versus a DPS conduit. And then lastly, the last ability here, and this is why I was kind of wavering on putting Kleia here in this good category or in ugly, just because unfortunately the last ability, Valiant Strikes, doesn't give us any kind of a DPS bonus at all. It's just a healing ability. I think Kleia would be fantastic, especially from a DPS perspective, if this did something from like a DPS perspective as well, because right now it's basically like, oh, well, if you're taking Kleia, it's the healing one, right? I wish they went a bit more universal with this. So if you don't know Valiant Strikes, you and your nearby allies' critical strikes grant you stacks of this buff up to 40, and then at 40 stacks you heal yourself for 10% of that your max HP, and up to 4 nearby allies for 5% of the maximum health over 10 seconds, right? Unfortunately, again, there's no like you gain X stat for these stacks or whatever, which would make this kind of over the top and amazing. I hope they kind of reconsider this and give it some kind of generic throughput option here, because just healing is kind of sad. Which means, again, you're going to use this because of that immunity, probably more than anything else. But again, I think it's a nice option to have. So, and guys, that's all the good things that I can think of for the Kyrian Covenant. Let's move on to the bad and ugly stuff. Okay, so moving on, what is bad about this Covenant? Well, there could be a couple things here, but I think the main thing I wanted to cover is the third soulbind here for Kyrian, which is Forgelight Prime Mechanicos. I just don't understand what its purpose is. There's just not enough here to give him oomph. I can only find 2 things I really wanted to talk about here. The other abilities here are basically neither here nor there. He doesn't give a lot of throughput options, and if any, really. And the utility options he gives instead are just not worth it. I think I'd put this soulbind in the category of a lot of the other Necrolord ones. There's just not a lot here that's exciting. The first thing, the only real good part about this is Hammer of Genesis, which is damaging an enemy grants you 2% haste for 10 seconds. Stacks up to 5. Again, similar to other things though, this ability is competing with a throughput conduit, so you're basically saying, is this better than a third conduit in that slot, right? So my third best conduit, more or less. Obviously, this is going to be better in Mythic Plus. You get a lot of haste here, up to 10%, which is great. You just have to keep up that buff stack of killing something every 10 seconds, basically, or hitting someone new every 10 seconds, which might be difficult if we're just mind searing and hitting everything instantly, right? But it's okay. I don't think it's that bad, and we do love haste, which is great. Literally the only good thing about the soulbind, though, obviously that damaging a new enemy component doesn't really work in a raiding environment, so you probably would never take it there, except on those big AoE fights. And then the only other thing on this soulbind that's left worth talking about, just because it's just laughably horrible, is Braun's Call to Action, which is the last guaranteed ability you get for taking Forgelight. It's definitely cool and interesting. You basically summon Braun after using, I think it's 120 spells and abilities. You summon this guy. Last I checked, this just doesn't do any damage at all. It's like super useless. Again, it's just a melee guy that gets spawned, so God forbid your target moves and this is just thrown away forever. So yeah, I don't. It's very cool and interesting, but it's not good enough. There's no part of this, and again, 120 spells, that's a lot. You just don't see him very often, and he doesn't do a lot of damage. Just kind of makes this a really terrible soulbind, unfortunately, which is kind of stinks, but that's where we're at. But let's move on to the ugly stuff and really get into the meat and potatoes of my biggest problem with this Covenant. Okay, so what's ugly about the Kyrian Covenant? Well, frankly, this could be ugly, bad, whatever you want to say. Boon of the Ascended, our Covenant ability. I don't think this is as bad as the Venthyr ability, Mind Games, at least in my opinion, but I feel like this ability just really doesn't hit the mark for what I'm looking for as a Shadow Priest specifically. I think parts of this could be interesting from a healer perspective, but honestly, this button is just very, very strange. We effectively hit something, go into a separate form, and basically we're like a Kyrian priest at that point for about 10 seconds, and we're only casting those Kyrian abilities more or less during that time frame. And it just feels really weird and disjointed from the entire rotation. You're effectively saying, I'm going to stop being a Shadow Priest for 10 seconds and just hit these Kyrian buttons for a second. It doesn't fit into the rotation, just feels disjointed completely. And I think that's what really gets me about this. The biggest problem with this too, on top of that, is that you do have to be in melee to get maximum potential out of this ability. Right, so if you're standing at range on a boss where you can't be in melee, there's only one component of this that you can cast at range, which is the one that replaces Mind Flay. So Boon Ascended has 3 components. The first one, Ascended Blast, which replaces Mind Flay, but puts it on a cooldown, so you can't spam it like a traditional filler. And then it also gives you a spammable button. That spammable button is only an 8-yard range, right? So if you're not in melee, that just throws us out of the water, right? And then after you use all these abilities, you generate stacks, and then you explode at the end, and the explosion is a 15-yard range, which is equal to the Necrolord range, but still, we're a range class. It just feels really, really strange. It can do a lot of healing as well, but, again, that's not why I really like Covenant abilities and why I think they can be cool and interesting. And I think it just, the fact that it doesn't fit in the spec just really bugs me. And unfortunately, after the rework, because Ascended Blast, when we're inside of this form, replaces our filler, there's some weird problems with this when you're sitting inside of like an area where you want to chain Mind Flays together outside of Void form. Because typically right now what we're doing is we're using Mind Blast, we're keeping our dots up, using Devouring Plague if we have enough Insanity, and then we're basically filling with Mind Flays to get procs of Mind Blast or whatever else until we have Void form. Well, the problem is, if you use Boon of the Ascended outside of Void form, which still unsure where the best part about it is, it's hard to optimize this ability right now, that means you're replacing your filler and you don't have a filler to spam anymore. And so if you're at range, that means you literally have to sit there and spam like Shadow Word Pain or something to do anything because of that cooldown, which is really awkward to use, and I think it's also kind of annoying, right? And again, right now, on a single target perspective, it's not even worth hitting the spammable ability. Obviously, they could change that with tuning, but it's just really clunky to play with. I hate using that word, but, that's what it is. The only thing good that this thing has going for it is it does do a lot of damage. It's one of the best single target throughput options that we can take right now. Again, obviously, numbers are still work in progress, so don't, build that up too much because that could always change. But, yeah, honestly, I'm just super disappointed with this. I don't really have a great idea of how to fix it, so to speak. It just feels like they just slapped some Kyrian abilities on the priest and said, have fun weaving this in. It doesn't really fit or give you anything or interact with your spec. Heck, even one of the abilities doesn't even give you insanity, but that's what it is. So, not my favorite thing in the world. I wish they'd redesign it, but, who knows if we have time for that. Alright, guys, that is it for the Kyrian Covenant. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know if you're interested in Kyrian or if Kyrian sounds cool to you, or maybe if there's a use case I didn't bring up. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But that's it from this Covenant series. Hope this was interesting. I still have no idea what I'm going to pick. I'm kind of torn between, I think Night Fae has some good options, but some of these other guys from Mythic Plus look good too. Honestly, I have no idea what I'm going to pick. Hopefully Blizzard fixes some tuning problems and makes these spells actually fun to play with and fixes some soul binds. Then we have a better options here. Alright guys, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.